Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. Now, I have to admit, an automatic correction I've got to do at the start of this episode. I celebrated it being our sixth season on the last episode, but actually, it's our seventh. You can tell this local election is really starting to get to me at the moment. But welcome. We are doing this just as Rachel Reeves has done her budget announcement, so we're going to get into that and other things that are going on in the political space this week. But first of all, we have a brand new person on the podcast. He is a councillor in Powys and actually one of my favourite Lib Dems, especially at conference if you're sharing a drink with. He is an absolute legend of the Welsh Lib Dems. It is Councillor Glyn Preston. Welcome to the podcast, Glyn.
Thanks ever so much for having me, John.
Yes, and as well as Glyn, we have obviously the favourite, no matter what electoral system you use for the Lib Dem podcast presenters, whether it's PR, first past the post, or dictatorship, she would absolutely win. Welcome back, Hannah Kitchen.
Thanks, John. It's really easy to come top when you eliminate all of your opponents by getting them elected as MPs, so they never come on the podcast anymore.
That's true. It was me, Hannah, Rocket the dog, and that was it. Really, was the competition, and Rocket pushed me into third. So that was yeah. So, but Hannah, first of all, before we get into all the huge news of the day and of the week and how things are going, obviously Lib Dem conference has just happened in Harrogate. You are obviously on the conference committee. How was that for you? How did it go?
It was intense, as spring conference always is, because it's essentially only a day. It was very delightful to have everyone in Yorkshire, of course. Very delightful to hold conference in somewhere that actually has a Lib Dem MP for the first time in some time, I think. Yeah, we got really good turnout, really good registrations. We passed some not particularly groundbreaking policy, but there were a couple of high points. I had my first and hopefully last appearance in the rally on Friday evening.
Did you really? They've got to get the crowd pleasers in, Hannah. That's what it is.
Because a certain member of the media team twisted my arm so hard up my back it almost fell off. So that was great. So yeah, definitely recommend having a little watch back of that. Lisa Smart was tremendous. There was a piece about the new Lord Shafak Mohammed, which there wasn't a dry eye in the place. And then I went out to bat for Yorkshire basically for 5 minutes, which is, pretty easy gig, really. So that was fun.
Sounds pretty difficult from a Lancastrian. I don't know.
And well, I wasn't even born here, so I don't think I'd even be eligible, really. But the Lib Dem's not as strict as Yorkshire cricket. And then we had a classic war between the English Party and the people in the Liberal Democrats who like to win elections. And I'm really delighted to report that election winning won that particular war pretty overwhelmingly.
This was about candidate selection and things like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, this was about putting the responsibility for candidate selection with the rest of the bit of the party that does our general election strategy, rather than leaving it scattered around 3 other places across the party. So yeah, that was all good. And the other really good bit of news was that F9, which was our equality spokesperson's paper on absolutely sort of reinforcing our commitment to LGBTQ plus rights, also passed in the hall and online with absolutely overwhelming support from the pro-LGBTQ majority of our party. So yeah, couple of quite exciting moments in the hall, and Glee Club happened, as it always does.
Fair enough.
And the leader did a speech.
Glyn, are you a Glee Club kind of guy? I think I've seen you on conferences singing the Welsh national anthem, and I think that's about where you've got to.
Yeah, I think drafted in for the Welsh bits. I think is the sort of max of what I commit myself to with Glee clubbing, to be honest.
Fair enough. Well, speaking of things that aren't Glee and aren't happy, let's go on to Labour and their budget. So Rachel Reeves has just delivered. A lot of this was already pre-release, we knew some of the stuff, particularly on welfare cuts, which is massive. But the broad numbers is there were no further tax increases in this statement, mini budget, emergency budget, whatever the heck you want to call it. I mean, it is. Let's just get the elephant in the room out of the way. As someone who chairs scrutiny for a council, the fact we get the OBR report after they've actually given the speech, so you can't actually scrutinise it, is such a stupid way of doing politics in this country. But that's what it is. And actually, as with all financial budget and announcements, the devil is always in the detail, and it always comes out in a couple of days. So we will dig into that and probably have another episode coming up. But the big headline is economic growth has halved for next year, which is obviously horrendous. It does go up over subsequent years, but again, there's a lot of stuff about house building and reforms to planning, and all of us being local councillors on this call, and I know a lot of Lib Dems listening and watching this podcast will be very much aware that planning and house building is not a simple black and white issue, and we can get into that because a little bit later on, because I have quite strong views with someone who has a lot of house building in my area. Does not mean you give developers a free road just to put social housing wherever the heck they want, in terms of like putting it in some grotty corner of an estate instead of actually doing proper planning policy on it. So that will be really interesting going on how Labour are going to do that. The big ones, they've done stuff on affordable homes, more construction workers, but the stuff that came out, which was very controversial last week, is stuff around with welfare cuts and what they're going to do, and particularly around PIP payments. This is, and it was, and I'm going to read something out just to kind of start us off on this, because the head of a disabled charity here in Preston basically said this, so I'm actually going to read it out, what it is and what it says. It says, life costs more as a disabled person. Huge numbers already live in poverty, and as a result of these will have extra costs. The impact of any cuts to disability benefits will be absolutely devastating. Now, she is also a Labour councillor in Preston. She's gone public in saying that today. Now, I think the fallout of this could be immense. Now, Glyn, what's your view, first of all, on the budget, but I think the big point is these welfare cuts that are going to be hitting some of the real vulnerable people in our areas.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that there'll be a huge number of Labour voters around the country that will feel very, very let down by this Labour government and feel that this is not the reason that they voted Labour in the last set of elections. There are some of the cuts that have been announced are things that not even the last Conservative government considered doing.
George Osborne's come out saying, we looked at PIP and I just ruled it out. So that is a hell of a statement for Labour to have to deal with.
Yeah, indeed. And I just before I joined this call, I was just talking to a friend of mine who actually works in sort of work and pensions policy or what have you for a well-known national charity, and she was saying, she's just having a sort of cursory read of the impact assessments now, and in the language in there is pretty grim. It means that some of the most vulnerable people in our society will be worse off, undoubtedly.
Anna?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's, I think everyone understands that, Labour want people in work. Everyone wants people in work. We want people contributing to the economy, but also, leading fulfilling lives. And for a lot of people, work, a career is part of that.
Yeah. And
I think there's also a broad understanding that the welfare bill is absolutely gigantic. And I think there's also an understanding that there are some people claiming benefits who probably aren't entitled to them.
That's the same with any policy, though, isn't it? Not everything you ever do, there's going to have that show off. Yeah.
And do I think that these proposed reforms, cuts, changes are going to solve any of those things? No, I don't. And as is always the case, the people that get hit hardest by, these sorts of changes, it's the same with the winter fuel allowance. It's the people who are already only just coping really with what they're on. And I think what's particularly frustrating for me is that, so we know that health and social care is a mess. Just something as simple as, if you want a knee replacement, like, you're currently waiting more than 2 years for a knee replacement.
Yeah.
And people are currently waiting months, years for pretty basic pieces of elective surgery. And because they're not getting that elective surgery in a timely manner, that means that they are unable to work, and they are therefore claiming disability benefits. So, maybe tackle hospital waiting lists, and your welfare bill will come down. Similarly, the main sort of reason behind this huge leap in the welfare bill has been a huge increase in young people with mental health conditions and challenges who are not in work, and that's particularly since COVID. So for me, the answer to that is, let's invest massively in mental health services, because you cannot get a CAMHS appointment for your kid unless they are suicidal. Basically, that is how bad the CAMHS service is. And instead of announcing massive investment in mental health services, we have the actual health secretary coming out saying, what he said was, I think mental health conditions are overdiagnosed, which I interpret as him saying people are making this up.
Yeah.
People are using this as an excuse.
But they're also, Labour are using the language that the Tories want them to use, which is which is this thing that it's not quite the scroungers versus savers thing, but it is giving that impression that these people, and let's see, let's just break it down. The biggest single claimants on welfare, the biggest single chunk of welfare in Britain is pensions. The idea that things like PIP and things like that represent a huge chunk. Obviously, we're talking masses of money when we're talking about the grand scheme, but pensions represents by far the biggest. And it just feeds into that beast that the right wing love, that somehow that if you're not at work, you're somehow work shy. And we've talked previously. I had a counsellor of mine who had to give up being a counsellor because she was a SENCO, she was a special educational needs psychologist, and she was thinking about retiring and she couldn't. COVID threw all of that. That safety net that was there for all those kids was gone, and now we're seeing the fallout of that. And it is interesting, and it's a weird kind of one. And the chat about this, because there's been lots of stuff in the public thing all about the Netflix show Adolescence, about Gareth Southgate coming out and talking about it. There's something happening in Britain because it's not reflected in the rest of Europe. So kind of people that were off during COVID in the rest of Western Europe have gone back to similar levels. In Britain, we haven't. So that is a huge, and you're probably right, Hannah, that we're dealing with the consequence rather than the cause of these issues. And if any of us know anything, whether that's about police or education, that's the more expensive and more difficult way of doing it. And I think, Glyn, we have to be honest with ourselves and say, look, this probably isn't going to work what Labour's doing, because if they do cut down on these benefits, you'll get a cost in another area.
Just in addition, that unemployment in this country is historically at one of its absolute lowest levels ever. And so, the idea that this is sort of, I do appreciate that these are, the number of people claiming PIP has gone up and all the rest of it. But, if you look at things in the round and look at sort of a broader section of history, actually unemployment is very, very low, and we're nigh on full employment at this current level in time.
Yeah, and we could talk about obviously the politics of this as well, because it is really interesting. Because I'm currently in the middle of my local elections, and welcome, it's the first day of the actual local election campaign officially today as we're recording. So before we go any further, we should just tell all those Lib Dems, get your nomination forms in, don't leave it till the last minute. Get your booking. I'm going in on Friday. It's my next day. They're off to be able to get all this stuff done. Absolutely do not wait. Get going with them. I'm sorry, I got really distracted. Hannah, did you just lift up a dog's paw halfway through that then? Just that she doesn't keep that on a piece of string, listeners and viewers. She's got her lovely English setter is lying next to her. But yeah, so local elections have happened, but the politics of this. And what's really striking is how badly Labour are coming across at the moment. I mean, I've never, ever seen both main parties so in the doldrums with people. And just yesterday, I was delivering leaflets and a lady just stopped me. I wasn't canvassing, I was just delivering. Said, "Oh, I've been a Labour voter my entire life. They are not the Labour Party anymore," which is, I mean, it's grim, Hannah, but politically, I'm not sure this is going to do anything to save them. I just feel Labour are really don't understand what kind of hole they're in.
No, I mean, they dug themselves into a hole, didn't they, with their general election manifesto and their fiscal rules, pledging not to raise income tax, not to raise national insurance. And, we absolutely understand not wanting to go back on a manifesto promise. But it rather feels like all the small things they're doing instead of going back on that manifesto promise are probably doing them sort of even more damage because, and I think the thing is as well is it's cumulative. So they are, okay, we know they want people back in work. There's so I don't always give credit to Barnsley Council, but over the last couple of years, they have actually done a really good piece of work, which is called Pathways to Work, and it was like a commission, and it's been given a pilot, South Yorkshire pilot, and then possibly a national pilot. And if you look at that piece of work, what it basically says is exactly what Glyn just said. So unemployment levels are at pretty much an all-time low, but we have a lot of people who are economically inactive. Yeah. So not in work, not actively seeking work. And this sort of commission sort of sought to address that. And it sought to address that in a really like proactive, collaborative way. So basically by working with employers to say, I guess really around sort of flexible working. There's a whole cohort of like mums with babies and toddlers who just really, really want a job between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. 3 days a week. And those jobs don't exist. And if those jobs existed, they would do those jobs. We know there's loads of people with, as you say, mental health issues, either diagnosed or undiagnosed neurodiversity, who struggle to fit into like the quite tight world of work, but with a bit of flexibility could become economically active. So that's what that piece of work was around. Great, well done, nice work, Barnsley Council. However, since that, we've had a Labour government, which has, number one, created this jobs tax. So they are making it, employers, small businesses are now looking at, a minimum wage, which is, it's really quite high. I know people are still struggling to maintain the cost of living, but for employers, it makes it hard to differentiate between your skilled and unskilled workers, and the national insurance employers' contributions. So we've got businesses, particularly small businesses, actively saying we can't recruit, we can't increase pay, and in some cases we're going to have to lay people off because of Labour's job tax. And then we're saying, okay, you've got mental health problems, you've got a fairly sort of chronic, broad-ranging disability. Yeah, we're going to cut your benefits, like get your backside back to work. And it's just that all of those factors combined, how is that like that collaborative, working together approach that, I genuinely think is the way forwards on this?
Yeah. I mean, I have no problem with raising the minimum wage. I think the point we have a minimum wage that you pay tax on is ridiculous. How can you possibly say this is the bare minimum you need to survive, yet we're then going to tax you on it, and actually it should be uplifted? But it's the national insurance contributions, which is absolutely brutal for business. I mean, it has destroyed business confidence. I think it's as lowest, the only time it's been lower was during COVID. That's how bad it is, Glyn. And I suppose, and again, it just gives the impression that, whatever we think of whatever's happened over the last 14 years, if you stand on an election of change, that one word, Keir Starmer looking like all in black and white with just change in red, this isn't what people bought into, is it, Glyn?
No, it's absolutely not. And I think looking ahead to the elections that we're about to have next year in Labour-held Wales, Labour have been running the Welsh Parliament earlier the Assembly for the past 26 years. And it does really look as though there's going to be a big challenge to their potential authority in that Parliament. And I suppose picking up a point that you were making, John, it's not the Conservatives who are offering that alternative. It's actually reform in lots of places, and I think they've got clear, simple answers. And we appreciate that these are really complex challenges and complex problems, but Reform are offering people a very simple answer to these problems. And I suspect very much, and what I'm picking up through my canvassing already, is that there's no enthusiasm for Labour for the most part. There is still no enthusiasm for the Conservatives, but people are sort of splitting off, particularly in Wales, I think, to Reform.
And I think, Glyn, I'm really interested for your opinion on how Labour are feeling at the moment. So this time last year, because I've got Lancashire County Council elections in a month's time, Labour were absolutely sure they were going to take back Lancashire, and they just cannot. I just don't think they can believe the wheels have fallen off the government so quickly. And I wonder how, and you just feel it in them that everything about them is very defensive, and they've got so many I've got to say enemies. That's not the right opponents attacking them from all sides. You've got Lib Dems challenging them in areas. You've got Independents. You've got Greens. You've got Reform. You've got the SNP in Scotland. You've got so many different people vying for that Labour vote. I think they must be in a real chance of it completely fracturing. And the idea that, we talked about this poll where Lib Dems are only 7 points behind, any of all the major parties together, is that just, not that long ago, Labour had a 40-point lead over the Lib Dems, and now that's down to 7 or 6. Labour councils in my patch are tearing their hair out, or trying to just kind of putting an ostrich, putting their head in the ground. But how are they feeling in your patch, Glyn, in actually the Labour actual activisms and the enthusiasm they've got?
I think the morale is very, very low. There are lots of things that have impacted on councils as well. So Hannah was mentioning, obviously, the changes to national insurance, and that has had a huge impact on the sort of related sort of council industries like social care, what have you, and that the challenges there. So I think Labour councillors are really very much under the cosh and feeling firsthand the sort of consequences of the decisions being taken in Westminster. As for Labour activists, I have never seen morale so low, and it's interesting. I don't want to overstate the Green Party's opportunities too much, but equally in that poll that you referenced, John, the Greens were up to 10%, and I suspect that what is left of the sort of Corbynista left in the Labour Party, or indeed even verging into the sort of soft socialist left of the Labour Party, I think is going to move almost wholesale over to the Green Party.
And it is interesting because I think what's going to happen, and I know Hannah wants to come in here, is my view on these local elections that are about to come up, and it's really difficult, and I can explain it about the intricacies of Lancashire because there's so many moving parts, but it's almost a nightmare to predict. But it's the general feel I get is whoever gets themselves as the lead challengers to the Labour and Tories, whoever gets that momentum, whether it be it us or Reform or an independent candidate, whoever's seen right, it's obvious in seat X that the Lib Dems are the main challengers. I think they're going to do really well. But there's going to be, as we know, a shed load of places where basically Tories or Labour have got in near enough unopposed. There might be paper candidates against them. There might be areas where, there's someone half decent locally, but generally it's been a Labour stronghold or a Tory stronghold for years. And those seats, I am genuinely fascinated on about what, from a standing start with no work, what happens to that vote. I think it's really interesting. Hannah?
It's interesting as well, isn't it? Because politics is so volatile at the moment. So, you were saying this time last year, Lancashire Labour were absolutely so confident they were going to take the county council. And to be fair, if the county council had been up last May, they would have done.
Yeah, they would have.
and can't believe how quickly the polls have changed. And I think the impression that I'm getting from Barnsley Labour is that to some extent they're clinging on to that volatility. So it was, we don't have any elections here this year, or indeed in most of Yorkshire. The big ones to watch are obviously Mike Ross in the Hull and East Yorkshire mayoral, but also Doncaster are all up, which is going to be an interesting one to watch, because it's mostly just Labour, to be honest. There's not, we're not active there. There's not a huge amount. Really, the Tories should have taken it when it was up 4 years ago, but they didn't. They fluffed it. Only got 11. So I think a lot of Labour activists, Barnsley Labour here, are clinging on to that volatility and sort of saying, well, it was so good 12 months ago and it's so bad now. And I think it's reasonable for them to say the situation is not going to stay the same for 12 months. That volatility will continue. And I think the other question is, yes, we know that the vote is fracturing, but fundamentally, we still elect under the first past the post system. So you're right, it's whoever positions themselves as a challenger and comes through. But I guess from the incumbent's point of view, whether that's the Conservatives or Labour, depending on where you are, when you see a vote fracturing, even if your own vote is not really holding up particularly well, what you say is, well, they can't choose an opponent to get behind.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, I suspect a lot of them are crossing their fingers that they'll just come through the middle and win a seat on, 27-30% of the vote.
I was going to say, because the winning margin is now going to be so low. You pretty much, well, in my seat, so what did I get? I've had various seats I've defended, but my county seat, actually, weird enough, I've had 43% both times. And that, in 2021, just got squeaked me through with 100 and something odd votes. If I have a feeling, if I got 43% this time, I might have a 500 majority instead. Yep. I think that's, but Glyn, and I remember, I'm not breaking any confidence here, Glyn. I remember after the general election, we were talking about box counts and all the rest of it and things like that. And I remember, because you were at Brecon, and obviously David got elected as our MP with 29% of the vote. I think it was one of the lowest percentages there. So you have a kind of a lived experience of knowing that when you've got less than a third of the vote yet somehow win, and that fracturing of politics in that seat must have been terrifying. I think you said you were at the count and you're thinking, well, we're not going to win this. Just looking at our vote, and in the end, you came through the middle.
Yeah, I suppose that feeling is not particularly sort of confidence inducing when you're seeing a sort of four-way split. It's not how election counts are meant to feel.
Yeah.
Certainly when you were looking at the tallies in particular boxes, it was very sort of eyebrow raising. There were a few people after the election that were sort of quick to say, oh well, we were lucky that the rights vote was fractured with reform. I suppose implying that, that somehow might be able to be reconsolidated. We're almost a sort of year on now, and it doesn't seem like that's the case. And indeed, locally, the Conservatives lost their last councillor in Brecon Radnor and Cwm Tower, the seat that David represents, as he, along with a few other independent and Conservative councillors, defected to Reform UK. Mm-hmm. He actually, sorry, just one last thing. He was I think, believe to say, the agent of the last set of elections and chairman of the local party. So that is a big blow to the Conservatives locally. And I suppose it's sort of symbolic of the situation the Conservatives will find themselves in across lots of those seats that they've lost to the Lib Dems.
So Clint, can I ask, is the right reconsolidating, but consolidating around Reform rather than the Conservatives, or the other traditional Conservatives still sticking with them?
I don't think it is reconsolidating totally behind Reform, and I think there are still lots of former Conservative voters who could not countenance voting for Reform. That being said, there might be bigger demographics of people who are willing to vote Reform in different areas, and so whether there will be some of those soft Tories who will be willing to tactically vote for reform when push comes to shove, when an election comes. Who does know?
And that's one of the big things, obviously, that the Tories are also hoping for when it comes to the next general election. If they can boil it down to who do you want, Labour or us, then they're hoping that siphons those reforms with. But it is and I want to talk a little bit about reform because obviously we're getting to this point. So we've had again, headlines can be also quite deceiving in terms of this. So two Conservative county councillors joined Reform last week or the week before. Now, both of them had been deselected for various reasons. One, because one of them forgot to actually apply again and then wondered why he had got deselected. And the other one is just... He just didn't do his work locally. He got outdone by someone else that was better within the Conservative association. And so obviously a simple choice for them is now to jump ship to Reform and it gives themselves that boost. But one of the big ones that happened was actually a leader of a council here in Lancashire, so the Ribble Valley Council, or Tory, has also gone. But again, if you think about that behind the scenes on that, he knows his council isn't going to exist in a couple of years. He is getting himself prepared for and he hadn't been selected for a county seat, and now is going to be fighting a county seat for Reform. So there's all this stuff going on behind the scenes. And I'm not dismissing the threat of Reform, because that would be stupid to do that, because they are getting roughly a quarter of the vote in polling pretty consistently now. But I'm not giving away any secrets of my campaign data or anything like that, but I really analyse, thanks to actually Glyn's excellent work. Actually, I do my switch analysis, which is seeing where votes are going, okay, who's doing what, and it is really interesting. And I get that in my patch, the four big divisions we are properly going at to try and gain is that we are doing loads of effort. We are the natural challengers in that, and that shift from everyone, Lib Dems all over the country are terrified of Reform. And if I had Hannah Perkin here, who's getting a lot of Reform attention in Kent, is very different to here in Lancashire, where they're very isolated into different little pockets, like on the coast or in like kind of the outskirts of Burnley or somewhere like that. They're not here. That actually, they are probably quite useful for me. As I was explaining, I might get 43% of the vote again in a month's time, but go from 100 majority to a 500 one, because Reform eats into that Tory vote more than anywhere else. But I suppose the question, Hannah, and this is it's a speculative one, is that a lot of stuff about elections is about whose voters are motivated. Tories have had no motivation and it hasn't really come back. Labour voters, as Glyn was saying, are pretty fed up with the state of the world. They might not vote anyone at all. They might just stay at home. Will Reform voters, or people that don't normally vote at all, will Reform's ground game be good enough to get them out for a local election? That is that's my big what if.
I mean, I don't think Reform need a ground game, particularly in the same way that we do. And, you know, listeners know that the answer to all of this is get out there and do your ground game yourself. So, you know, I think that Reform have a flaw to their vote, which is probably, to be honest, somewhere around their national polling figures, really without lifting a finger to be on, purely in the air war.
Reform will get 20% across the board without doing anything in locals.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, what did they get in our by? I'll have a quick look what they got in our by-election before Christmas, and they did very, very little.
Yeah, okay.
But the caveat I'll give you to that is that I think that Farage's ongoing support of Trump, I think, is already starting to harm him, actually. And I think he's going to continue to harm him. So, you know, in our Barnsley by-election before Christmas, they were faffing around with these stupid little crappy leaflets with a picture of the local candidate and a bar chart from Blackpool. Why are you doing this? You just need an A4 leaflet, picture an age, stop the boats, vote Reform. Like, that's literally all they need to do. But you know, if we were to, you know, put out a leaflet saying, like, vote Nige, back Putin, I think there's a pretty global understanding, even amongst reform voters, that Russia is bad people. I think that is fairly kind of like universally understood. And the more that, I mean, I know that this seems like a level of politics that is beyond the average British voter, but I genuinely do think that the more that Farage continues to support Trump and the more that Trump continues to support Putin, I do think that is going to backfire on reform, because Russia are bad people and like everyone kind of knows that. So it'll be interesting. I don't know if you're sort of picking I'm not out on the doorsteps as actively as you are at the moment, whether that sort of gloss and that whole sort of kerfuffle over that MP as well, is the gloss coming off their air war, I suppose, is my
for me, and I'm going to let Glyn come in because I'm interested in his opinion because of reform's kind of strength in Wales. But for me, a lot of party internal politics tends to affect its activists rather than actually the general public. So the whole Rupert Lowe, Nigel Farage thing, most people won't have even noticed. But you do notice, because I now have to follow, I don't have to, but I do, all the reform pages, because they've all got their local social media kind of pages kind of set up. And what's interesting, it's the activists underneath that who are talking about being dispirited over Farage versus Rupert Lowe. Most members of the public won't give a shit, really, one way or another. But it's really interesting about how you deal with this, because it is... Whatever else is happening, it's playing on the mind of lots of Lib Dems about how you deal with reform, that resurgent kind of populist thing. And for my view, and you, again, Glyn, and you could completely disagree with me, my view, and I've got one of my leaflets here, is if they're not doing anything, don't give them any attention. They are not on my leaflet. That was obviously the result from 2021. Why would I give them credibility when they're not locally credible? And that can be really tough. And some Lib Dems are desperate to tell people they're wrong. But actually, what's more important here on this one is saying, do you want hardworking John Potter or do you want a Tory that never shows up for anything? That's your choice. And that, sorry, for all the viewers, for the listeners, beg your pardon, I was holding up one of the bar chart, the trusty Lib Dem bar chart, completely accurate bar chart as well, just in case. But Glyn, what's your response? I mean, do you agree with me that unless reform are going all guns blazing, that my view is to actually don't give them credibility and just squeeze the buggery out of them?
Yeah, I think you're totally right, and they've certainly not been going on my leaflets, but figuring out those lines to be able to rattle off on the doorstep, I think is really, really important. And I'm not sure I've quite sort of got a total understanding as to what works best. I'll just make a broader point, if I may, and I don't want to be sort of too sort of philosophical about it, but just, I think reform voters, I think they've lost faith in politics' ability to do good in people's lives. And I think, what better way to show people that reform is not the answer? What better antidote to that than our sort of form of community politics? Giving people a stake in the decisions that are happening close to them. And so, I don't know, maybe that's a sort of wet Lib Dem thing to believe, but I genuinely do believe it, that we have the antidote to this, right-wing populism.
Anna, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree on that point. But I think what is particularly bizarre, troubling, is the extent to which I feel like so many of the decisions that the government is making at the moment is around pandering to those red wall voters and pandering, to reform. So I think that, you mentioned it earlier, that sort of like scroungers versus savers, that I think they feel that, cutting disability benefits is, we're not paying people to sit on their backside, I think is a message that they think will appeal to reform voters without a shadow of the doubt. The cutting international aid to invest in defence, stop sending, you see it on every single Facebook, stop sending money overseas, stop sending money overseas. We know that if you stop sending money overseas, we're A, more likely to have wars, and B, more likely to have people fleeing those wars and coming to the UK in their small boats because we won't create any safe routes. So, yet another sort of message that seems to be trying to pander to reform. And I think I mean, we saw a bit of this while they were in opposition, that just sort of like, firming up on some of that, like curtailing the right to protest, refusing to overturn the two-child benefit cap. And what they were assuming was that, the left, the left of the party, whatever, their Leeds Central, their Cambridge, type
The
electorate,
suburban Labour. Yeah.
yeah, would suck it up. London Labour would suck it up, would forgive them, would turn a blind eye in order to vote the Tories out, and they did. But I don't think they're turning a blind eye anymore. I don't think they're prepared to suck it up anymore.
And it's a terrible election tactic. Sorry, Glenn, I just wanted just because I've got this. So it's exactly what the Democrats tried to do with in the States with Trump. Let's go slightly on their turf. It doesn't. Why would someone who's that inclined want like a semi-skimmed Keir Starmer when they can have a full-fat Nigel Farage? You're never going to outdo them on it. And it's baffling to me why so many political parties do this. It's almost like they enter panic mode, Glyn.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And it's, they absolutely risk hemorrhaging votes to ourselves, the Greens, etc., and parties of the left more generally, don't they?
And it's bad politics. Like if if Nigel Farage's policies and populist philosophy on politics could turn our country into a place of amazing, growth and change, like great, that's fine. Copy his plans, but they don't work. Populism doesn't work, and so pandering to populist policies by trying to slash the welfare bill and trying to not send overseas aid, it's going to end up worse for the country. And who's that going to reflect badly on? It's not going to reflect badly on Nigel Farage. It's going to reflect badly on the Labour government. They're so bad at politics.
Can I make one other point internally about the Lib Dems? I mean, I think it was said amongst our membership sort of broadly before the last general election that we had a sort of boring message and it wasn't very inspiring for sort of activists as to why they'd want to get involved. There is nothing more inspiring or sort of something that makes me want to get off my backside and do something than hearing a Labour government talking about cutting international aid and cozying up to Trump. And actually, I've had a few new joiners recently in my own local party, and the single thing that they mentioned was the fact that Ed Davey was the only UK party leader willing to stand up to Donald Trump. So actually, it's bad for the country, but in terms of motivating our supporters and people with liberal values to go out there and do something, I'm sort of hopeful that we ought to be able to use that as a party to our advantage.
And I think there's two strands to this from a campaigning point of view, from where I stand. So talking about big international, big things, the anti-Trump stuff, all the rest of it is really good at reassuring your base. It's really good at energizing your members. But for me, I don't spend massive amount of time doing that in my patch because that's what HQ will do. HQ's work will get us more, will help us get more members, get us that kind of vibe and all that sort of. My view and the part I play in this organisation is to motivate at the ground level. And that's where, so you let the HQ deal with the overarching umbrella stuff, and I get down to the nitty gritty, get your hands dirty, and sometimes it's the local, it's the potholes, it's whatever else, but the stuff that people care about all the time, regardless of who's in power. That's so you hit them on both strands, and that's where I think we've seen it a lot with Lib Dems that instantly wanted to rejoin the EU. Constantly. And I would say to him, look, you've got to win that battle first. And at the moment, at the last general election, that battle wasn't ready for us to win. And what Hannah was saying is, and Brexit was a really key point about when you placate things that you don't agree with, is that Tony Blair did that for years about Europe. Never say anything good about Europe. He kind of left that pitch entirely for the right to talk about straight bananas or wonky cucumbers or other such nonsense. And so then by the time, and I said, this was years before Brexit, whenever it comes about, whether we have to ratify a new agreement or something like that, we would lose because it had festered this view because it was never challenged about the good stuff that EU did. It does a whole load of other weird stuff and crazy stuff we might not agree with, but generally, as we've seen, it was an overall benefit to our country, but no one was fighting for that argument. And so by Labour using this language, taking us right back to the budget of, not scroungers, and they haven't used the word scroungers, but that kind of thing that, you could be doing more, you could be back at work, that sort of language, if you are letting reform lead on that issue, you will never get it back. And I think, like I said, it's terrible politics. If it does change, so just say my election this time, hopefully I win, that's obviously primary goal. But if reform comes second in my patch, us as Lib Dems suddenly do have to figure out, okay, we do have to talk about how they want to sell off parts of the NHS, their ridiculous stance on Putin and Ukraine, and also and in your patch, Glyn, you represent a rural community. They are part of the responsible for this Brexit disaster that's happening to our communities and our farmers and things like that, and actually holding them account for that stuff, but only if they become a threat.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. Entirely, and I think you're absolutely the right approach. That they should not be featuring for the most part on our literature, and I don't want to be really reminding my voters of their existence, or by sort of that, or sort of validating that they might be a sort of potential threat or something that you might vote for in a local election.
So, Glyn, I think generally what we're saying is to Lib Dems, go out there, if you've got elections, go out there with confidence, go out there, do your groundwork, don't get, I'm going to say, distracted by reform, because they are big, they make noise and all that sort of stuff. But actually, and from my own view, from all the canvassing I've done, the instant response from people, there are people that you knock on the door and they are delighted to tell you they're voting reform. That's not the vast majority of people. And if you look at that polling numbers, what's really interesting about reform is actually the amount of people who dislike reform is massive. Absolutely huge. So don't over-egg your pudding and think, oh my word, reform are going to completely trample over us because they've got some loud people in flat caps speaking very angrily about small boats. Concentrate on what wins for Lib Dems. Good old-fashioned community politics and graft. And let the National Party deal with the national stuff. You win at your local level. And it'll be street by street, it'll be door by door. But, Glyn, in summary, the Labour budget is going to cause them issues. And I suppose as an opposition, we've got to be ready to step up, call those issues out and hold them to account.
Yeah, I totally agree. We've spent a lot of our time, I suppose, talking about reform and that potential threat. And I think, there are massive opportunities with the unpopular decisions that the Labour Party are taking nationally. And I think crucially, we can only really make best on those opportunities if we're the people shouting the loudest about these changes. And I suppose, sort of reiterating what you've already said, John, it's our duty, it's our role to get out there and knock on as many doors as possible and to deliver our positive message about how we want the country to change in volume over time.
And with that, we will go. I mean, as viewers will notice, Hannah has disappeared. The Wi-Fi in Barnsley has finally given up the ghost. But firstly, I want to say thank you very much to Glyn for coming on this episode. Let us know in the comments if you want Glyn back. We won't be democratic. I don't run this like a democratic show. I like Glyn too much to leave it up to chance. So we'll no doubt have Glyn and his wonderful Welsh experiences coming back onto the podcast. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to Hannah. I'm sure she's probably throwing a Wi-Fi router at a wall as we speak. And thank you very much for listening. We've got some really good stuff lined up. I know the podcast hasn't been as regular as what we were last year because of my involvement in local elections and knocking on doors. And just to let you know, I've done 12 kilometres today before coming on the thing, and I'm about to now go out canvassing. So every minute counts at the moment. But thank you very much for subscribing and for following us and liking us on our social media and things like that. So really appreciate your time, and thank you very much for watching, and we're back with another episode next time.